I just saw this statistic today come through. I saw a study that came out that said 61% of healthcare workers are reporting an significant increase in like mental health issues since the pandemic started. And there's a lot of data that shows domestic violence is on the rise, more people seeking therapy. We're still kind of just beginning to understand and the ripple effects the data shows of similar things in the past, can play out for years. But the data of just, the last 6 to 8 months is certainly concerning.
Is this now a mental health pandemic? Welcome to Women of Wayland podcast. This is your host Yamini, and today we are back with episode 4, season 3 with Whitney Fair. This episode is brought to you by Go Allegro School of Music. When the pandemic hit us and we sought out relief in gardening, running, carpentry, or picking up that musical instrument we have always wanted to learn, it was the right thing to do. Because music moves us, like literally. It uplifts our mood, adds an additional dimension to our lives. It is no surprise that during the pandemic, many of us turned to learning music. Based out of Western Mass, Go Allegro is a traveling music school, offering private music lessons to students of all ages and levels in the comfort of their own homes. Yes, you heard that right. They come to you if needed. And you also can learn at their Western studio or virtually with highly trained teachers. I love the flexibility. If you're still social distancing, take advantage of their virtual classes, and if you're comfortable already, they can come to you. We are so glad to partner with them in our efforts to raise funds for our local nonprofits, and we hope you check out their wide selection of classes at www.gogoallegro.com. At Women of Wayland podcast, the remarkable stories of next door women are not just about their professional experience or success. They're a combination of their experiences of travel, work, outreach, personal victories, and so on. But on today's episode, we are focusing heavily on our guest's professional expertise. As the pandemic raged, we as a nation finally were forced to confront a health issue that has been lurking in the shadows of physical health: mental health. Our guest today is Dr. Whitney Fair, a clinical psychologist. Whitney is extremely passionate about mindfulness and its many health benefits, along with remaining attentive to mind-body connection. In this episode, she talks about changes in the types of problems her clients were facing and how even her own lifestyle had to change due to COVID-19. Welcome to our show, Whitney. Thank you so much for coming on our show. It's a pleasure having you here. So, how did you end up in Wayland?
Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me. It's such a great honor to be included. And So I moved to Wayland in 2013. I knew for me that I lived in Boston this summer between college and grad school. And I just always kind of envisioned I would probably settle back in this area because I love being near the ocean. I love being able to get to the mountains. I just love everything that New England has to offer. But actually Wayland, was so competitive even back then that it was like on the list, but we're like, we'll check it out. But interestingly, our first day out with a realtor, the third house that we saw, and it went to best and final overnight. And here we were. So we really thought we were going to be somewhere else. And then that was it. But we feel so lucky. We love this location. It's so convenient. You can be downtown very quick. We're close to 90 and 95. And it's great people. So
I can't imagine first day in third house and you lock in a house. How did you end up in this profession, Whitney? Specifically, when did you know you wanted to be a psychologist? And what drove that decision?
Yeah, so I guess it's interesting. I always think of two things when I think about how I became a psychologist. I remember even in high school, I was always kind of a bookworm and I would read the paper sometimes. And I remember reading at the time, this had such an impact on me about, it was a very prolific foster care case when I was in high school, where there was a group of kids, and I think it got so much national attention because it was such a large group of kids, but it was essentially kids who were taken from their families due to neglect and maltreatment and placed with a foster family. And then it became clear that essentially these kids were even further abused in the care of this family. And the article really highlighted that this was a growing problem. And I remember really like my worldview being shattered of this idea of like, wow, I just assumed everyone's parents were loving and providing. And it really was the first profound experience of being so aware of my privilege.
How old were you?
I was probably like 15 or 16. And I just remember thinking that is so horrible that we have kids growing up whose parents can't provide for them. And then we have this system that's meant to take care of them in place of that. And they get, so often, further abused or mistreated. And so even before I knew I wanted to be a psychologist, I used to say, like, people are like, oh, what are you going to do? And I'd be like, I'm going to reform foster care. Like, that just is so wrong. And then I kind of forgot about it. But I will say that I was always really interested in biology and then took some intro to psych classes. And once I got into biopsychology in the field of neuroscience, I was like hooked. I just think the idea of how neuron impulses firing add up to what we understand as emotions and consciousness is just fascinating. But it became clear kind of in my junior year of college that most people, if they were interested in neuroscience, they worked with in labs. My sister is actually does that work. And so she was working, doing fascinating research, but in a lab, always operating on I think it was rats or mice. And for me, I've always just been a people person.
So you wanted to be on the front line with the...
Yeah. And so I loved neuroscience, but I was like, I want to do something where I'm more engaging with people. And so it just became a natural fit.
It's so funny how, who we are today is part of what we wanted to do back in high school, or something that inspired us. I'm glad to know that you followed your inspiration, your reason, and your cause. Whitney, I'm going to take you back to last year, and I remember you doing this amazing, fabulous job with our Instagram takeover. We had so many questions, and follow-ups on the page. Your takeover spoke about COVID. I think those were the beginning days of COVID, and we were all, in anticipation, and, we didn't know what was coming. It wasn't the saddest period of time, I would say, but since COVID, 1 year has passed, and I want to know how COVID has changed your work.
Great question. There's so many places I could take us with that question, but I guess what stands out is in the beginning, it was a lot of helping my clients grapple with uncertainty. I have this quote that I actually noted here from one of my mindfulness mentors, that at that time, 2020 is waking us up to the river of uncertainty underneath what we thought was solid bedrock. And so it was kind of this idea that our routines and our habits and our life as we know it gave us so much of a sense of control. And then when this pandemic came and really shook all of that, the way we work, the way we live, it really shook up people's worldview. And so I think a lot of my work with clients was helping them kind of just grapple with their relationship with uncertainty. How long is this going to go on? How bad is this going to get? And just trying to really help people stabilize. Now, I would agree with what you kind of said just before about it. For a lot of people, I don't think that was the most difficult time. It was maybe the most initial kind of shock and a lot of fear with the unknown. Though now, it's more helping people grapple with living in this very contracted way for so long. And really, what I hear so much coming up a lot now with people is just realizing, that it's almost like kind of, it's been so slow and insidious, but realizing that they just difficulty concentrating, difficulty focusing, like this element of like brain fog, that just, it's a very different thing now to be living this way, so different, where people have adjusted and people have adapted. But we're starting to kind of come out of the trenches as there's hope with the vaccine, and people realizing like, wow, I've been in survival mode so much.
Yeah.
And now, I wouldn't call it even depression or anxiety. It's just the manifestation of living with this chronic stress on a scale that we've never seen before. In fact, there's a lot of research that shows that kind of what people are grappling with, you'll see after like a major national disaster, like a hurricane or an earthquake. But the fact that it's been for a year now, that so many of my clients, they figured out how to live and manage day to day, but just feel this overarching kind of sadness.
I don't know about others, but I'm definitely experiencing brain fog, procrastination. I'm not so productive. I think it's been going too long now.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. The reason why I asked you this question was because, while you were filling up your clients, your patients' life with positivity and, measures to cope up with this uncertainty, how were you filling up your own bucket?
Well, I think the key things that I've always gone to are, one, just exercise, being active. It's interesting that for so much of my life, a huge identity was being a soccer player. I played competitive soccer.
Wow.
And actually, I peaked in high school. I like to joke. I did the Olympic development program and actually got to play with Abby Wambach back in the day.
Oh my God, lady. See, so many things to learn about you.
Yeah. So for me, that was always like, if even when I was in grad school, like I would play intramural soccer, I would play in these co-ed indoor leagues. And that was such a huge part of my life. But so for me, that's been, I think the hard thing was a lot of how I take care of myself is moving my body and getting exercise and not having that available. But another thing that I've really gotten into is mindfulness and meditation. I started meditating in 2013 when I was pregnant with my son. That was the first time that I started kind of trying to keep a daily practice. And my husband actually introduced me to the Headspace app. And so that's been, I think, a big thing with so much of what I like to do to fill my cup, not just not being available in the past year. The one thing I have really protected is getting movement. So I was doing this class that I kind of stumbled upon that's a mix of like cardio and meditation. It's a lot of burpees and strength training, but as you're going through it, they're coaching you to kind of pay attention to where your mind is going. So it also feels like mindfulness as well. So I've just been doing that for the past year. And through that class, that's now has a live streaming platform, they offer a lot of like weekend retreats. And so I've been doing a lot of kind of mindfulness and meditation workshops as well. But I mean, to be honest, it's a lot of the simple stuff of like taking breaks to get outside and go play with the kids. And I think connecting with friends has been a big one as well. Just trying to stay connected with people.
Some great suggestions there, Whitney. Thank you. Wanted to know about how has it impacted your own work? Talk to us about the overworked health workers and psychologists and about your own experience. Did you need support?
Absolutely. I think it's interesting that, so for a particular form of therapy that I do, dialectical behavioral therapy, it's actually part of the treatment approach that therapists who do that work are on what's called a consultation team, which is basically like peer supervision. Because if you're doing DBT, you tend to work with more acute patients who are struggling more, particularly that, we tend to work with people who are struggling with suicidality. And so in those meetings, which are every week, and I still participate in them with many of my McLean colleagues, there's kind of like a protocol or general flow to those meetings. And the first one is everyone goes around and rates their burnout and then puts themselves on the agenda if they have any particular cases that they're struggling with or just issues with a client that they want some additional help thinking through. And in the last month or two in particular, it's become kind of this bittersweet joke that when we go around and rate our burnout, it's like, yes, I'm burnout. And because normally if someone has higher than usual burnout, we might as a group try and offer that person particular support. But I mean, as a group, people have been joking about wanting to like quit the profession because it
Oh,
just
wow.
feels so difficult to continue in this way, because there is this hard reality that people will talk about as kind of the silent or second pandemic of the mental health issues that are building.
Yes.
I think for sure, to give people a comparison, I used to get a new referral maybe one or two a month. And there'd be sometimes months where I wouldn't necessarily hear from anyone. And again, some of that is because a lot of it is word of mouth and colleagues just kind of know when you're full. Though now I'm getting referrals, sometimes new referrals, several in a week. And I know many colleagues who have spoken about, as a profession, we are people who have heightened empathy and compassion and really an identity that's very linked to helping people. And so we already have a propensity to overextend ourselves sometimes.
Yes.
But many of my clients have been saying, or my colleagues have been saying, they're adding sessions and slots to their practice beyond what they would normally set their capacity, because they just, it's kind of like we talk about the frontline workers in the beginning. They were scared, but if I don't show up to work and take care of the sick and the ill, who's going to do it? And that's, I think, how a lot of psychologists and therapists feel of this. I know this is not the healthiest thing for me, and yet this feels like my call to duty to try and stretch a bit. So, and I know even for myself, I will say some of my clients are continuing to kind of plug along. And some clients even were doing initially better. For example, a lot of my adolescents who struggle with social anxiety, being removed from the pressures of school, a lot of what drove a lot of their distress day to day and week to week was now kind of a moot point, especially when people weren't socializing in the beginning. And yet now, I mean, even now I have clients in the last month or maybe every other week, that have had emergent stressors and are wanting weekly. And I have some clients who, are weekly and feeling like they're struggling even more and wanting more than that. And it's really hard for me and my colleagues to know where to draw that line. And I've just been trying to do it as best I can. But I'm definitely at a point where I have at times thought, oh, could I maybe take on another one? And I was actually thinking about, okay, maybe I'm at a place. And then several of my clients started asking for increased frequency kind of January into February. And I've had to just kind of hold the line. It's definitely, there's a lot of bracing collectively in the field, I think, of people just, we're running out of who to refer. Like it used to be, even if I was full, I could always find some other people to send names along. And we're getting to a point where that's just harder and harder to do.
So, Whitney, talking about the social anxiety, and, yesterday was the first day of school. And we're recording today, which is the second day. Tell me, as a mother, how did you feel sending the kids back to school?
I felt great. In fact, last Wednesday, which was the last day of remote learning for my son, because he's cohort B, we celebrated. We made a cake. We blew off the last session of the day journaling and went to the playground and really tried to just. I was just doing a lot of reflecting of like, wow, what a year it's been, and really trying to help my son internalize, like, I'm so proud of you. Like, this has been hard. And, for him at the end of the day, it's like, whatever, we get to go to the playground.
Were they happy to go back to full time?
So happy. I mean, just the thing that he was most excited about was just to see friends that he hasn't seen in a long time. And, again, when we think about even like its impact on my own life, I've heard from so many friends, particularly in January, February, like my son, he definitely struggled initially, as we all did, but got into a groove pretty quickly. I think it certainly was easier for him to adjust to this new way of remote learning and living than it was for me. Though I was amazed at how many friends would tell me this story of like, oh, my child used to be so outgoing and now he's more recluse, or, my child, was maybe not the most outgoing, but when they saw a friend, like they were excited and we had this interaction even one day where my son's got some friends at some of the other elementary schools, and he hadn't seen them in really a very long time. And we went sledding, and they didn't know how to talk to each other.
Wow.
And it was so bittersweet that they were so excited to see each other. And then when they got face to face, there was this awkwardness and this social anxiety. So I'm just so thrilled. I think that honestly, I was, even as a therapist and a mom myself, I was increasingly concerned with, particularly again, like I think my son just hit a wall in January, February. I was hitting a wall in my own work of burnout. And so he was suddenly struggling more. I was less patient, and the day-to-day struggles and emotional meltdowns. And I heard this from so many friends. So I'm just so thrilled. Though I have to say, and being fully transparent, it was interesting that on Wednesday, I told a friend, I was like, I feel a lightness like that I haven't felt in a really long time. Like, I'm not talking wedding day happy, but like, I haven't felt this level of like happiness and just excitement for the future and having a taste of that. And then we got that email about the water situation. And I was like, I could almost see the cloud coming over my head, and he was Simon and Garfunkel, "Hello, darkness, my old friend," and I'm just like, no, just give me one day. One day. We'll figure it out. But it's just, I was like, I can't. I'm tapped. I cannot handle one more thing.
I'm sorry. This cracks me up because you're right. Just when you were about to feel so happy about things, you have another thing to worry about and be anxious about. I'll talk about that. Probably not on the episode about the water situation. But there's a water situation, dear listeners. So Whitney is talking about that, and I'll fill you up on the post on Instagram. All right.
Just to say, the last year has given me a lot of opportunity to practice how to deal with that. And
yes,
it was an interesting moment, but ultimately I'm so thrilled. And the first thing I did yesterday, I set it up last week, was I did my first in-person workout class. It was just, something I took for granted, and it was just such an exciting thing.
So you're not into the Peloton wave?
No. Yeah. I actually feel really like I'm missing out, though. I see all these people posting about doing shared rides, and my neighbor has one across the street, and I'm like, I got to come borrow a ride. Physical exercise, even just 30 minutes of brisk walking a day. Like I'll show my clients these data of how neurotransmitters, will jump and stay elevated for hours. And, in Europe, they will sometimes prescribe a physical regimen of exercise before people can go on an antidepressant, because it's so effective beyond kind of the things we think of.
That's an interesting thing I learned today, Whitney. I mean, even my GP prescribed me yoga and mindfulness when I was going through postpartum anxiety. So yeah, totally true.
There's, as much as we have come leaps and bounds with combating the stigma of therapy, and just, I could talk for hours about how men and women are socialized in our culture and society to deal with their emotions differently, though I definitely think that for many reasons, it's just there's more barriers to males coming in and asking for help, though.
So building on this, Whitney, we see that there is an evidence that the impact of the pandemic has been different for different demographic groups. For instance, it has been harder for essential workers, certain ethnic groups, even women as a whole have fared worse than men.
Absolutely.
Talk about your views on this, if you have observed this in your studies and reading.
Yes, I think it's been there all along, though certainly it does seem like, there's a common response I've heard many times, that we're all in the same storm, but we all have a different boat. And I think that is very true. And, I think even when this all began, I remember my husband and I having discussions about how are we going to, if schools don't go back, what is that going to look like? And hearing, I remember hearing from moms about like, oh, do you want to form a pod? And, my husband and I just really struggling with trying to figure out what's best for us, though also having all this guilt in our white privilege of like, we're so fortunate. And we were very conscious about, even if we could do something like that, is that really something we can do from like a moral and ethical perspective, when we recognize that, I guess the most plain way I think about it is that we have so many problems with social and racial inequality in our society. And I think that's what really breaks my heart the most as a therapist, is I'm doing what I can to help the people that I work with, though those inequities are just getting exacerbated. And so I think for me, that's one thing when I think about, when my kids are in school and I have the ability to ramp up my private practice, I've said to my husband, I don't know if I necessarily just want to add client hours. I feel like, my work one-to-one with clients is meaningful, but I really want to be doing something more on a community level.
That's so
because
nice. Yeah.
I think, until we're all on equal ground, we're all going to suffer, whether we realize it, or not. They talk about this, even the parallel of first world countries. We can vaccinate our population, but and we might not be concerned about what third world countries or people around the world and more impoverished nations are doing. But if they're not getting vaccinated, eventually that's going to be, a challenge for us, because it's going to continue, what's the word? Mutating. And then our vaccines might not even be effective. That's something that, it's one of those things that it really bothers me. And then I go back to like, okay, focus on what I can control. But there's definitely something to be said about some people are struggling more than others. And I think, the data just shows that particularly women, working moms who have young children are carrying a very, very heavy burden right now in trying to just make it all work.
Whitney, culture influences behavior, family interactions, social experiences, and other aspects. How much do you think your program or your studies were adept at handling such differences, the cultural differences that we see? Because individuals may differ from each other to some extent because they belong to different cultural group. Just wanted to understand that aspect of your work.
Absolutely. The program actually, where I feel very fortunate that the program where I went to graduate school, several of the researchers in my particular program were doing kind of cutting edge research on social justice and multicultural issues in counseling, which was something that I didn't fully appreciate and even know going in, though that's definitely something, any program that's worth its salt in psychology, there is this essential component that until you understand your own layers of privilege and identity and how those shape your worldview, you can't truly be an effective therapist, because there definitely are certain trends when you work with different ethnicities, different racial groups, of things you need to consider that if you don't do that work, I remember there actually being a very intense course where this was all we did, was we wrote and did some deep work as a small cohort of looking at, our own life experiences and how they shaped us, because it's just so important to appreciate that, or you can replicate harm without meaning to.
Whitney, building on my previous question, just wanted to know, I'm just curious, if your clientele is diverse.
I would say that's one of the biggest challenges of my work right now, is that my clientele is not very diverse. And I think that, again, the majority of my caseload are adolescent and young adult white women. There have been exceptions to that, though. I think about earlier on, like I did a postdoctoral fellowship where when I was in Chicago, I worked at a residential treatment center for DCFS wards of the states. And the majority of the population that worked there were Black children who came from the DCFS system. So these were people who were removed from their homes due to abuse or neglect or inadequate resources. And it was such an eye-opening experience for me, being early in my career even, of, just what that was like to, even for them, I think seeing me as like, oh, how's this white woman, and they look at me and just see this white woman of privilege going to be helpful to me. And, I think just for them, there's this extra layer of just helping build trust that is so difficult that, is not even an issue in
That's so
the work that I
insightful.
do now.
Yeah,
Yeah.
thank you. Thank you for being so honest.
I think and yet it's a powerful experience for them and for myself. I mean, I think even actually back before that, I remember I had an internship one summer when I was just in college, and I worked at a juvenile detention center in Syracuse. And I was working with a lot of what was kind of in the Syracuse newspaper, the gang infested neighborhoods of Syracuse. And then I meet these kids and I'm like, these are just sweet kids that haven't been given the tools and the resources that any child should have. And so I think ultimately, in my experience, in my training, what often is the most powerful facilitator of bridging this divide, if you will, of racial inequality, social inequality, is by creating experiences that are, well thought out, certainly, but of just cultural immersion experiences. I remember part of going back to that class in graduate school, part of our assignment was to have to go somewhere where we were the minority and we were going to feel really uncomfortable and to sit with that. So for me, it was, I went to the local community in our town and went to a traditionally Black church service and was the only white person there. And, immediately afterwards, people were kind of like, welcome and thank you for coming and so inviting. But they were also like, okay, white girl, what do you do? And even that, could offend people. And I was aware of that, of like, I think ultimately in talking with people, they appreciated the effort. But I think that's been an interesting part of this past year, right? The Black Lives Matter and what happened with George Floyd over the summer. That was such a significant moment for our country. And I think that there's a lot of work that needs to be done that I hope when we kind of come out of the COVID coma of just trying to survive and get through it, that we're really gonna, as a society, have to look at how people who are already left behind are further left behind with the way the pandemic has played out. And it's in everyone's interest to lift each other up and come together. But I find myself, that was actually one of the, I can say with total honesty, one of the concerns about Wayland. It's very similar to a town I grew up in, though, it's such a wonderful place and safe place to grow up, and yet it's such a bubble. And there was a challenge of, do I even want to raise my kids in such a bubble? I really want them to experience diversity in a deeper way growing up. So for us as parents, that's been, if we're here, what can we do to kind of compensate for that, has been a question in our house. When there were a lot of resources put out in the beginning of the pandemic, when all this, I saw people sharing like multicultural curriculums for kids and that sort of thing. There's so much work to be done. I don't think it's something that we're very adept at in this community, about reaching outside of our bubble and doing that. Although I will say, I think in the last year, that has been a nice thing, is people doing more of that and hearing from friends, just doing that curriculum, getting books in their house that represent more cultures and racial groups and ethnicity, and having those conversations with their kids. But
I saw a very good approach by Wayland Library, introducing the storytelling with the books, multicultural books, and I was very impressed, and I just loved it. I think you're right. It just has to be incorporated on a very grassroots level. Whitney, did the issues that people were coming to you with change as we endured the pandemic? What was the transition or plateau or the changes in issues that you saw?
Good question. I think in some ways, a lot of the things have been the same. It's just, so in the beginning it was, okay, life feels very out of control. Let's focus on what we can control, and just helping people look at what are things they can do to add into their routine to buffer themselves from stress. I think what has shifted is, having done that work, now it's a lot more of just having, for a lot of my clients, they've made the most out of what's available to them. And yet there's still these just residual effects of lingering kind of depression, anxiety, or what I think of as just the stress response of living this way. And so helping people just, the conversations do sometimes look a little different about this idea of we're doing everything we can and we still don't feel overall well-being and contentment, and how do we kind of just hold on a little longer and keep staying the course, knowing that that it's going to take a while for things to feel better. But it is interesting. There's definitely trends of things that I have found emerging in the past year, of things that people have gravitated towards. I think, for example, a lot of clients exploring creative outlets that they never would have maybe turned to. Like I think of, clients who started crocheting more, or, I think of this other client who she had just started a pottery class in school, and they gave students like clay to take home and kind of delve deeper. Or I think of how many friends of mine have taken up baking or sewing. There's something to be said about people getting more into craftings, if you will. And I think, to me, from my perspective, it's another way of pursuing mindfulness, of like when we are fully engaged in an activity, we're giving ourselves a mental break about all the awful things and just enjoying ourselves in that moment.
Building on this, what do you think could be some long-term impact on Gen Z of the pandemic? I'm really amused, but this term Gen Z, I'm reading so much about it everywhere. It means kids who were born right before the pandemic, in the pandemic, and who will be seeing the aftermath of the pandemic. So what do you think has been some of the long-term impact on Gen Z?
Yeah, it's going to be interesting. I think some of it, I have to kind of just be honest and say, I really don't know. We'll have to see what the ripple effects are, though. I guess I will say that there's enough literature and data about just how important the first 2 years of life are. That there's so much brain wiring that happens, and just how early on attachment relationships are so important. And so what I think of as kind of one of the natural developmental milestones of that early development is, developing a relationship with a caregiver. And then kind of once you have that secure attachment, feeling increasingly comfortable exploring the world around you. And, you think of the classic child who's maybe, out in the playground at that young age, but still kind of looking back and checking in with their parents. Is this okay? Is what I'm doing okay? And it's interesting that for so many parents, I think that while initially they enjoyed, because that's kind of what you do when you have a baby anyways, you kind of go into a cocoon in that early stage and just, soak up all that time with your infant. But yeah, I hear increasingly parents concerned about their child not being as adept at engaging with people socially. And so I guess I'm kind of two minds about it. On the one hand, I think it's going to be an added challenge that, I was just talking with a friend of mine the other day. Her niece has never really played with other kids that much because she was born in the pandemic, and worried about, so one question is, are more children going to be vulnerable to social anxiety, at least initially, because they haven't, had those typical normal early experiences? And yet my mind also goes to knowing that the neuroplasticity, like the ability of the brain to rewire and kind of recalibrate, is still so strong in those early years, that my guess is that there might be this transitional period, but that my hope is that in years down the line, it won't be as pronounced. But I think even now for kids who, have been around for a while, that's showing up. But it is interesting. The one thing I will say is I do worry the most about kids. They talk about them in the literature of kind of in-betweeners, who are actually my son's age, 7, 8, 9. So these are kids who have been alive long enough to really kind of know the world a certain way.
Right.
And yet they're not old enough to have as much of the brain power and capacity to kind of like express their emotions and work through them. So I do think that kids in that kind of age range right now are the most vulnerable to struggling because,
Yeah.
I think of even my daughter just a few years younger, as the pandemic began, she was 4. But I think for her, the memories aren't going to be as strong of this time. And for her, it's still kind of like new, but it's just not as much of a shock to their system, I guess, as some of the older kids.
Oh, this is so true. Absolutely true. Kids are so resilient. My kid, who's 4 years old, has been in the school since last September. The school has taken all the precautions, and they were teaching outside in the tent, and all the precautions were in place, and he had to wear mask all the time. He didn't hesitate at all. Also, even when he didn't have to wear it, he was still wearing it, and he could run around, talk, do things with his mask on. So, yeah.
Yep. I find that to be true for me and many others as well. They've adapted in a lot of ways more readily than I think. And some of that is because neuroplasticity. It's harder for us as adults. We're more set in our habits and our patterns and our ways. So, the other thing that comes to mind that I would add to that, and, at the risk of sounding a little Debbie Downer, I do think yes, this is challenging, and that often what cultivates resilience is having to deal with adversity at a young age. So I guess the caveat to any parent who might be listening and worried, like, oh gosh, my child's in that, 7, 8, or 9, or just in general worried about that, is that, this could be a really powerful thing that helps them to be the most resilient generation we have ever seen. And quite honestly, when we think about, for me, where my mind goes is these are also the children that are inheriting a very broken planet in a way that we've never seen before, that they're going to need to be comfortable with uncertainty. And so I think this might not even be the defining thing. Right now we feel like, oh my gosh, this is going to be such a significant thing in their life. But what lies ahead for them, this could be just preparing them for these larger challenges.
Okay, next question, Whitney. According to a research during the pandemic, women have increased their heavy drinking days by 41% compared to before the pandemic. And it also has shown that psychological stress related to pandemic was associated with greater drinking for women, but not men. I just want to know, were there days in your own life during pandemic when your psychologist self said, no, I'm not drinking, and you were like, let me just grab a drink?
Oh no, I'm just as vulnerable to all the vices as everyone else. I think it is, particularly with the alcohol, just taking that as one example. I think it is interesting that, I remember having these conversations when I would early in the pandemic, going into the liquor store, that, they were joking that their profit margins were never higher. There was definitely something to that. And I think, hearing that, I guess, again, from my clients being younger, not hearing this as much, but just from others in the community, of people sharing with me, even now, that they feel like they're drinking more than they're comfortable, that they, and for me, I think I felt that way as well. Like here's all these things in my toolkit, right, that help me recharge and unplug, going to the gym, spending time with friends, and all. Life was so contracted. Of my tools, the easiest thing, the most time efficient thing, was to have the glass of wine at night or two to help me unwind. And so I found, for me, I was definitely in that camp, and I actually made the decision there's many other layers to this, but I made the choice of, I actually need to say no to alcohol because my ability to moderate it right now is gone.
Okay.
And
thank you for saying it, because that's true.
yeah.
You go for one glass and then you become that impulsive drinker of like, okay, it's just one, right? I can have another one. Yeah, you're right.
Well, and it's funny though, but there's something to be said about like some people have joked about like the quarantine 15, gaining weight. And I know for me, like when I was like, okay, I don't feel good about the amount that I'm drinking, like I need to rein it in. I went through this phase of like ice cream, Ben and Jerry's snacking, so I was replacing with sugar and other vices. But, I know some people have gotten in the best shape of their life using this time, to go the other way. And so
how is that?
But I guess it just speaks to the wide range in which we cope. So for some people, I'm going to give myself permission to let that go because I'm in survival and this is what's making me feel good and helping me get through the end of the day. And for other people, I think their way of coping was life feels out of control and like I can't do a lot of things, but right now I have extra time. I'm going to really dedicate myself to this goal and make that,
happen.
A silver lining out of this. So it speaks to the full range of the whole human experience, I think, that
Absolutely.
you see both sides.
Yeah, and also the fact that in New England, winters are long and harsh, and you don't really, and there were restrictions with the gym and workouts, and it was, we were just confined to our homes. So if people were not working out, what else would they do? Was also one of the statements that we all got to hear here.
I will say though, I have to say that one of the toughest things for me as a therapist in the beginning, just being again fully transparent, was how many of my clients were struggling with, I don't know what to do with myself. I have all this extra time, and I was just like, oh my, I'm human too. In my mind, I'm having such strong judgment of like, do you know how lucky you are? Like, I would kill to have that problem. I am drowning and having no time. I'm either I'm sitting with clients or I'm with both of my children and there's no time, and so, that was a real challenge for me initially. Absolutely. Of just, they're entitled to their experience from where they're at, but how do I work with them when as a person, I'm just having such a strong reaction to their particular issue that they're bringing to me.
I recently interviewed a health worker and she had a totally different, we were not together in this at all. Like they were dealing with so much more than we can imagine. Yeah, different boats.
Different boats. So I will say, I guess just one other thought I had kind of tying into that question earlier about what have been themes. I mean, as I've said to my clients, I'm like, at the end of the day, we are animals. We are highly evolved animals. Though at the end of the day, what we need is really basic. We need shelter, we need food, we need a sense of purpose, we need movement. And we need connection. And so a lot of like going down to the basics of, yes, we felt more disconnected, but so a lot of it became about like, how do we have new ways of connections? But ultimately really at the key of what we need is a sense of belonging and connection. So we had to be unique in how we sought those things out. But those things are always fundamental and remain fundamental. But the wine can help for some folks. It is interesting, though. I have to say, I saw somewhere the other day, I was reading that that alcohol sales are on the decline. It's almost like there's like a society boomerang effect of people being like, okay, like I need to reel it in and rein it in. So there is a larger cultural shift going on of people trying to recalibrate.
Someone just said, if there's anything that you can do to maintain hope, that's really the way to go. I think they said it in a positive way, but what has been your biggest takeaway from the pandemic? What is the silver lining in all of this? Help us find some positive here.
Well, I think for me, just I've tried to really focus on using this time to look at what about the way I used to live do I not miss? And like how busy I was and how many things we did, like the birthday parties every weekend. I'm not saying I'm against birthday parties, but just like learning to be more protective of my time and energy, and just because I will have more bandwidth as life expands again, I'm trying to really cultivate like awareness about what I want to go back to and what I don't. And for me, the overarching thing is just relationships. Like, for example, I got very in touch when I started to really get terrified of losing my parents. And I realized how often we're so busy and don't make the time to FaceTime or call or connect with them as much. And that's been a really wonderful thing, that we've been more connected through technology in this past year than ever before. And I've heard that commonly. So for me, I think, trying to use this time of like, how do I help my life reflect more of what's important to me, which ultimately is really like enriching and prioritizing time staying connected to family and friends that I don't get to see as readily.
Yeah, and many of us don't even have families around. I don't have my parents around, and I look forward to every year end to go visit them. And it's been 2 years, more than 2 years now. I haven't seen their faces, and it's just heartbreaking. I think somebody asked me, and I said, I don't know if but I do know that that's one thing I'm looking forward to. Mm-hmm. So I think that the silver lining is different for different people.
Right. Yeah. My hope is that I will have, I think for me, that I've tried to really focus on, if nothing else, gratitude of, because at the end of the day, I can focus on how hard this year has been and how like contracted life has felt for my family, for myself, and just how miserable it's been. Or I can focus on how grateful I am that it could have been so much worse. And for so many people, it has been worse.
Very, very.
At the end of the day, it's important to be able to feel both sides, but to ultimately give more airtime in my mind to like what I am so grateful and fortunate to have in my life. And I think that, it's an interesting thing that I think what you mentioned, even like I just keep thinking like, I'm going to be so grateful and appreciative of having time to myself again. And that was something that I never saw as a luxury and really took it for granted. And so I hope that stays with me for a while after this. But it's funny, like even joking about the mall, you just reminded me that is something, when people are like, oh, what are the effects going to be like? I find that I think many people I want to normalize that for many people, being out and social is going to feel awkward and hard. I hear that from so many clients. A college student who, is used to just kind of seeing her roommates, 6 to 10 people, and going to an event recently. It was outside, but there were 25 or 30 people, and feeling really overwhelmed. And I consider myself an extrovert, and I've had similar experiences where I've gone out, and if there's suddenly like too many people at the grocery store, I'm like, I don't want to be here. Why is everyone, I just like, and I think that I think we have to be really compassionate and gentle with ourselves, that we're gonna feel weird and strange about being in large groups and coming together. As much as we're like, oh, I can't wait for that, that it's not gonna feel quite like we remember it either, and to just have compassion and grace with ourselves as we transition.
Absolutely, absolutely. Oh my God.
So have that panic attack. It's okay. You're a good company.
I don't know. I feel like I think I was pushing it. I'm always this joyful, happy person. So when it struck me, I was like, this can't be happening to me. It cannot happen. Mm-hmm. I'm into self-care, meditation, yoga. How is this happening? And then I realized I was not grieving. I wasn't letting myself, whenever things struck me or anxiety struck me, I used to push it down.
Yeah.
Not face it. And I think I'm facing it better now than before. Yeah. Which brings me to my next question about tips and tricks that can work for managing the stress and issues brought about by the pandemic. What has worked with your clients, or anything that you would want to share with us?
I think one of the key things that I find kind of fundamental is people protecting space to feel their feelings. And that sounds so simple, though I think again, that's part of why pandemic life has been so intense, is that we don't even before the pandemic hit, society or data showed that the way our daily lives and trends were going is that we're so busy that so often when things happen, we have to just kind of push through. I think about this example that I gave recently in a talk for the WCPA about, times where my son, was hitting his wall and we were having homeschool struggles. And then I'm trying to get on a Zoom and I'm losing my mind on him because, he's tired and I'm burned out, and then feeling awful about myself as a parent that I just lost my cool on him. But then I've got to, pull it together and jump into a session. And then at the end of the day, I'm so tired and burned out, I don't circle back to that. And I'm of the belief that, those kind of effective experiences, that energy can stay with us if we don't carve out the space. So for a lot of people, the biggest thing, and this is just my personal view, but it's rooted in research and my own experience, is if people haven't made an intentional effort to delve into mindfulness, to me, that's the biggest tip or trick, because of this idea that where our thoughts go, our energy flows. And so it doesn't mean that sometimes my clients will say, oh, okay, you want me to practice this developing my mental muscle so I can focus my thoughts where I want to go. And then you're going to tell me, just focus more on positive things. I'm like, no, that's toxic positivity. The challenge is, if you're cultivating mindfulness, you practice kind of observing what's going on and carving out time to sit with it rather than push it away. Because I think so often we tend to rely on avoidant coping strategies, numbing out in front of the TV. I mean, the streaming of shows that leapt up, and that's a very effective way of coping. But so I find if people are struggling, a lot of the biggest challenge is just to recognize it and get extra support, seek out therapy, seek out extra supports for yourself. Though I know for me, a lot of what really kind of helped me, in addition to some of the things I've named, was just staying connected to friends, having the opportunity to, sit with friends who are going through similar things and talk about how scared we are and talk about how hard this is. And maybe it doesn't make the problem go away, but there's a lot of research that shows that when we carve out that space and kind of make those negative feelings our friend and let them in and kind of sift through them in the company of other people, which makes it less scary, it's really powerful in kind of discharging that so we can have more energy to be prepared for whatever is coming next. But I do think I tell people, and it used to be with my clients, and I would say, I really encourage you to do mindfulness. Here's what the research shows, but I'm not going to force you to do it. It's up to you to make that choice. But in this past year, I've gotten a lot more of to me, it's kind of like mindfulness is like food. Because some people say, oh, I don't like meditation. That's not for me. And I'm like, well, that's like saying food isn't for you. You have to figure out what type of food you like or not like, but we all need it for sustenance. And I think about that with mindfulness. I'm like, maybe it's not going to be doing formal meditation, but maybe you're going to develop a craft or take up baking. And that is your mental outlet to give yourself those breaks.
Well, practicing mindfulness doesn't cost a dime. And I remember you taking over the Instagram and you said exactly the same things. And I wish I had gone back and, seen those clippings again.
Right. Yeah. And I will say, if there's anyone listening who's curious, there's so many great apps out there that make it so easy and palatable to just start. I know I started with Headspace, and they have like a 2-week trial that you can try it out. But I find for my clients who are more skeptical or come in even with these preconceived notion, Dan Harris was a very prominent newscaster who actually had a panic attack online. And, he's kind of like a stereotypical guy's guy, like emotions, be strong, be tough. And so when all of his doctors and people were telling him, like, we really think you should explore mindfulness and meditation, he was like, what? Like, no. And now he has his own app, because he's like, the people who are most likely to resist this, or just minimize its power, are those who really could stand to benefit the most. So there's so many resources out there that if people are interested, it's a great time to start. But I also just wanted to go back to something really important. You said that as you were talking, I was thinking about that's probably the biggest thing, that if there was a theme to my work in the last year, it's about helping people grieve. I think for so many people, their way of coping is, cultivate gratitude, focus on what's positive in the face, be happy that, people are staying safe and healthy in my family, but we still needed that space to fall apart. And that's so often more of my work turned into like, okay, this is the space where everything you've been, kind of keeping at bay to just survive and get through your week. Like that, let's unpack that. What are you scared about? Like what's been the scariest or hardest or saddest part? And I know for me that if I haven't done that in a while, it just happened. There'd be like weeks and weeks where I would feel kind of just going through the motions to just survive. And then something would happen, and I would just fall apart and start sobbing. And just let it happen. And that's what I mean about our bodies are very intuitive. Like if we don't let things discharge, eventually we're just going to hit a wall and it's just going to happen. So for me, I think a lot of it was helping people, grieve regularly for all the many losses that this way of life and change and chaos has disrupted our lives. And I think that's the part that, there's a lot of research that shows when people go through a major stressor, it really hits them after the stressor has passed. So I imagine there's a lot of people who might be like, you know what, like this has been tough, but I'm through it almost and I'm feeling okay. Like I feel like the repercussions are really going to hit a lot of people as life, as we get through summer and even into next fall. So even now, if people feel like they're doing okay, I would say now is the time while you have the energy and the bandwidth to start building in those supports because, the bigger wave could still be coming on the impact.
Oh my God, this was so insightful, Whitney. Thank you so, so much. It feels like I can sit here and talk to you all day about all the mental health questions I had in mind. But nevertheless, I'll let you go. Thank you so much for being on our show. And thank you so much for taking time out to talk to us and to share your expertise.
Thank you so much. I have to just tell you, I'm so passionate about this stuff. And as my husband likes to say, I'm a storyteller. And so I love doing this kind of stuff and just being able to sit down and have conversations. So thank you for the opportunity. I really enjoyed it.
Oh, you definitely are a storyteller. Thank you so much again.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Hello, listeners. Thank you so much for listening. I hope there were a lot of takeaways for you in the episode. The sun is shining bright. Summer is here. Enjoy that glass of lemonade or beer. But don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review our podcast on your favorite app. We will be back with a new episode in 2 weeks. Stay tuned. I'm Yamini, your host, and you were listening to Women of Wayland, the podcast.